Scary Things Police Have Seen, Part 25. One night, two officers were dispatched to an old office building that had been converted to a doctor's office. They were set to meet a key holder there to let them in regarding a motion sensor that had gone off. When they arrived, the key holder was already there and he let them in. They left the key holder on the first floor while they went to the second floor where the motion sensor had gone off. After they cleared the building, they went back down and found the key holder was gone. The officers asked dispatch to try to get a hold of the key holder so that they can tell him that the building was clear. Dispatch told the officers that was impossible because the key holder hadn't even arrived yet. The key holder was still about 10 minutes away. After the 10 minutes was up, a different person arrived and was confused on how the officers got in the building. They gave a description of the first key holder to her, and she told them that was a doctor that had committed suicide several days prior. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 46. This was sent to me by a nephew of a trucker who had an encounter with a police officer. This trucker was driving on Highway 152 in California. He got pulled over by a highway patrol officer. It was odd though, because the police vehicle looked like an older 80s model unit. The officer gave him a ticket and left. Later on, the trucker went to the courthouse to fight the ticket. The judge looked at the ticket, got up and asked, "Do you think this is a joke?" The trucker said, "Why?" The judge told him that the officer's name and ID number used on the ticket belonged to an officer that had died on that freeway almost 40 years earlier. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 42. This story was sent to me by a police officer in California who wished to be anonymous. On June 17th, 2002, an air tanker crashed near Walker, California, while on a firefighting mission. The crash was even caught on camera. An officer saw the crash and ran to it. While running through the forest, he came upon three men in flight suits who seemed dazed and confused. He asked them if they saw the crash, but they wouldn't respond to him. Since they weren't helpful, he continued on. When he got to the crash site, he found that all passengers on board were killed. There were three men on board that plane. The officer went back to where he saw the men in the forest, but he couldn't find them anywhere. No one else who responded to the crash site had seen them. The officer then realized that the three men he saw in the forest were the spirits of the crew members that died that day. Do you think movies like The Exorcist stem from real stories? An Ohio police officer shared with me his experience when witnessing a possible possession scenario. This officer responded to a call about a young girl acting strange in her home. When he walked in, the father was holding her down and attempting to read Bible verses as she screamed and fought to get away from him. The uncle even said she had pushed him to the ground. The little girl was 10 years old. She started screaming in a language none of them could understand. The officer thought she was just making it all up, so he got close to her and told her to stop. The girl turned her head to face him, and in a deep, low voice yelled, "Stay away from me." He said the voice that came out of her was not the voice of a little girl. Finally, an ambulance arrived to take her, and a priest was called to take over and bless the house. A Michigan couple in 2019 caught sight of a possible ghost on their nanny cam. Check out the footage. Something obviously catches the baby's attention. The couple went on to say an unexplainable scratch appeared on their baby after the incident. A group of paranormal investigators went to the house and believe it may be the ghost of the previous resident who died there. This story is about a cursed gold chain that comes from a police officer on Reddit. A 20-year-old man left a note and laid down on train tracks, ending his life. Police officers did their best to collect all remains and personal property of the deceased. The family claimed they missed items including a gold chain necklace that the man loved more than life itself. The police officers continued to look but had no luck locating the necklace even when using a canine. It just seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Later that night, police officers responded to another pedestrian versus train in the same spot. It was the man's 17-year-old little brother with the gold chain clutched in his hand. This story is about a firefighter in Idaho who saw a possible skinwalker. He worked in the Forest Service in Idaho. In 2004, he was working an incident in the Hells Canyon area. The firefighter was scouting ahead on an ATV and worked his way down an old logging road. Suddenly, he saw a bobcat run in the middle of the road and stop. He slammed on his brakes, but the bobcat didn't move and just sat there. After about 10 seconds, it let out a cat-like shriek and ran off the road and up a tree. The firefighter continued up the road until about a half-mile down the road, he found a small cabin. This was odd because he was on federal land and no private structures were supposed to be there. He checked the house and found the windows completely boarded up and shut. He saw a hole drilled through the locked door, so he peeked through. There wasn't anyone inside he could see, but he did notice the interior of the cabin was completely destroyed. He decided to leave and jumped back on the ATV. After scouting ahead, he turned around and went back down the road. Right where the Bobcat had been, he saw an old woman in a badly tattered nightgown and bare feet. She just stood on the side of the road watching the firefighter as he approached. He yelled to her and asked her if she needed help. The woman let out a scream, almost identical to the sound the Bobcat had made. She turned around and immediately climbed up a tree and out of sight. The firefighter left and began telling people about his experience. A Native American friend informed him he most likely encountered a skinwalker. Nurses witnessed death quite a bit. This story was shared on a nurses forum online. The nurse worked at an oncology department at a hospital. She was given charge of a patient who was dying and had been unconscious for several days. During the night, the nurse went in the room and she found the patient standing on top of the bed. The patient looked at her and said, "Don't let them take me." The nurse was obviously frightened and asked, "Who's gonna take you?" The patient pointed at the air and said, "That black thing up there." The nurse couldn't see anything. A few minutes later that evening, the patient passed away. If you enjoy these scary stories, like and follow for more, and don't forget to see exclusive stories on my Patreon. This story is pretty disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. It comes from a police officer who made a post on Reddit. Dispatch received a call from an older couple saying there was an unknown man just standing in their backyard late one evening. He matched the description of a suspect who was recently involved in a gas station robbery just down the street about 2 hours previously. Several officers showed up and split into two groups on either side of the house. They approached the man with their weapons drawn. They saw the suspect and ordered him to get on the ground. The man ignored their commands and didn't move. As they approached him, they realized why he wasn't moving. The suspect, after robbing the gas station, took off on foot. He cut through the older couple's backyard to try to get away. When he went to hop the fence in the back, he slipped and impaled himself on a fence post. He couldn't pull himself off, and his body weight slowly drove him down the post. It entered from down below and went straight up through to his shoulder. He literally turned himself into a human scarecrow. Friday the 13th is a perfect time for a scary story. A Reddit user in Amherst, Colorado wrote about an experience he had when doing a ride-along with his brother who was a police officer. The town is very small with only around 50 people, a church, a few houses, a grain tower, and a park. At about 3 a.m., they were making their last check through Amherst. They noticed movement in the park, but couldn't tell what it was because it was so dark outside. They drove up to the edge of the park and turned on the spotlight. As they moved the light around the park, they stopped it on the swing set. There sat a girl around 13 years old with her back to them. She wasn't moving and just stared at the ground. They looked at each other and the brother suggested they get on the PA system to call to her. He picked up the microphone, looked at the girl, but she was gone. There were no signs of her anywhere. The park was a wide open area and there was no way they could have lost sight of her in the split second they took to look at each other. Residents in Colorado talk about other similar hauntings in the Amherst area. Movie theaters are opening back up, so here's a scary story from Daniel, who worked at a theater in Danville, California. At this theater, there were reports of paranormal activity from staff. Daniel hadn't experienced anything like that himself until one night at a showing of Batman vs. Superman. Daniel was in charge of closing for the night. He locked all the doors and checked all the theaters to make sure there was no one left inside. After he finished, he and his manager sat in the theater showing the end of the last movie, where a man and woman were the only customers left. Daniel got up to go to the bathroom. Remember, at this point, there were only 4 people, including him, in the entire building. As he was washing his hands, he heard doors slamming in the women's restroom across the hall. He described it like the doors were slamming in a domino pattern, one right after the other. He immediately ran out of the men's restroom and didn't see anyone exit the women's restroom door. He knocked on the door and announced himself as a janitor coming in to clean. He didn't get a response back. He went inside and found all 16 bathroom stall doors swaying back and forth after being slammed. He checked every single stall, hoping to at least find a child playing or maybe a teenager pulling a prank on him. But he found nothing. He was the only one in the bathroom. He left just as the couple and his manager were getting out of the movie. I hope you guys like this story. Please like, share, and follow for more. And if you have any stories of your own, send them my way. This is a terrifying story from police officers in Richmond, Virginia. One night, several residents in a neighborhood called and complained about hearing yelling and screaming coming from inside a house. The officers got on scene and found the front door was ajar. They made their way inside and clearly heard yelling and screaming coming from upstairs. The staircase was narrow and provided little cover for the officers, so they yelled from downstairs and told them to stop fighting and come out. Their commands were ignored, and they continued to hear the sound of the fight escalating. The officers grabbed a shield and formed an entry team to make their way upstairs and stop the disturbance. Once the officers got to the landing, the screaming and shouting stopped. The officers again ordered whoever was fighting to come out, but all they heard was silence. They checked every inch of that house, but it was completely empty. The officers spoke with the neighbors about the incident. They were confused because the people who used to live in that house moved away abruptly for no given reason. There is so much paranormal activity documented at nursing homes. A CNA at a facility in Illinois sent me a story about something that happened to her this month. At about 1:30 a.m., she walked down the hallway when she saw a resident out of his room. He was sitting in a rocking chair in the corner of the hallway. She was confused because this resident needed a walker to get around, and the walker wasn't there. She asked him what he was up to, and he just stared at her. The CNA went to his room to get his walker to take him back. When she walked inside, she found someone in his bed. It was the man she was just talking to in the rocking chair. He had passed away in his bed. When she checked in the rocking chair again, it was empty. I'm about to show you possible paranormal activity caught on camera at a jail in London, Kentucky. The person who sent me the video is a former corrections officer at the facility. The video focuses on a cell that's supposed to be empty. And remember, correctional officers check cells almost every hour.
It's goddamn creepy.
Alright.
Is there nobody in that cell?
No! Listen!
Nobody's in that cell.
No,
It's closed right there.
When we was
you ready?
still there a while ago at 12:12, and there was a.
I'm not shaking so.
If you didn't see it, it looks like someone moves in front of the window. Remember, it's a jail, and the only way in or out is through that door you're looking at. This story will freak you out, especially if you are home alone. It was sent to me by a resident in an old house in Fishkill, New York. He was home alone one night when the rest of his family was out traveling. At about 10 p.m., he heard a loud crash come from the hallway. He checked to see what it was and saw a vase smashed on the ground. The vase was secured on a table to prevent it from falling, so it would take a lot of force to push it down. He started cleaning up the mess, and that's when something caught his eye. Down at the end of the hallway, in the shadows, he saw a dark figure about 10 to 15 feet from him. He ran out of the house and called the police. They responded immediately and checked the house, but found no one inside. He was certain someone had broken in, but all the doors and windows were locked and secured, and there was no sign of forced entry. The doors were even alarmed and never went off. The creepy part is, the house even had some indoor cameras that covered parts of the house that didn't pick up any movement. At about 1 a.m., the police officers left and he went to bed. But it wasn't over. Later on that night, he heard what sounded like someone walking outside of his bedroom. While in bed, he pulled out his phone and checked the camera app to see if he could find anything. He checked each camera, and the only thing that stood out was his German Shepherd in a bedroom downstairs. The dog was obviously upset, whining and whimpering. He went down to see what was wrong with the dog. When he got there, the dog was growling and barking like there was someone in the room. But it was completely empty except for him and the dog. He decided that was enough, and he called his cousins to spend the rest of the night with him. Good luck sleeping tonight. This story comes from an EMT in Texas who recently had a paranormal encounter. Due to staffing issues during the pandemic, EMTs in this area helped out the coroner to pick up deceased bodies. A woman on hospice had passed away in her home. The entire family was in the living room, and they directed the EMTs to the bedroom. The EMTs went inside where the body was alone and began placing her in a body bag. They finished and began pushing the gurney outside of the bedroom. One of the EMTs glanced at the bathroom attached to the room. The door was open and the lights were off, but the EMT could clearly see the bathroom mirror. In the reflection of the mirror, the EMT could clearly see a figure standing in the bathroom. It was the same lady they had just placed in the body bag. When she looked further inside the bathroom, there was no one there. Paranormal Hospital Stories. This story was sent to me by a former security guard at a hospital in Greenville, South Carolina. One night, there was a motion alarm and a computer alarm that went off in the surgical wing. The security guard checked the camera system but didn't see anyone there. The other security guard called him on the radio and told him to meet her by the surgical wing. She said she refused to check it alone. According to her, there had only been one employee death at the hospital. It was a surgical tech who used to work in that wing. He had an addiction to general anesthesia and would often sneak to the area and get high while working. One day, after breathing it in, he slipped and fell. He landed headfirst on the ground and suffered brain damage, which ultimately killed him. Ever since his death, motion alarms and computer alarms go off at random in the surgical wing. Some nurses claim that they have been grabbed or scratched while walking around in that area. So people who work at that hospital never go in the surgical wing alone at night. Imagine how scary it would be to be an inmate in a haunted prison. This story comes from a guard at a prison in New Mexico. He worked at the facility segregation unit where inmates are kept alone. One night after lights were out, this guard began conducting security checks. He was on the second tier when a new inmate stopped him and asked him to talk to the guy in the cell next door. All night long, there had been knocking on the wall in between their two cells. The complaining inmate yelled at him to stop several times. Every time he yelled, the pounding would stop, but would resume shortly after. The guard looked inside the cell and told the inmate it was completely empty. The guard returned to his colleagues and told them about what the inmate had said. His colleagues informed him that the last person to reside inside that cell was an inmate who hung himself just days prior. The scariest things police have seen. This story is from a Texas police officer who responded to a motion alarm call at an old funeral home. The door was unlocked, so this officer and his partner began clearing each room to ensure there was no one inside. They cleared every room in the entire building. After checking a room, they would prop open a door to make sure they knew as a tactic that they had already checked that room. There was no one inside the funeral home except for a few dead bodies. On their way out, they walked down the main hall where they entered through. They passed a door that was shut, but they were certain they had checked that room already. They opened the door and found the room was empty. As they walked out of the room, they heard a loud bang coming from the very back of the funeral home where they kept the bodies. They knew the building was clear, but they felt very uneasy, so they went outside to wait for the owner. When the owner showed up, they told him about what happened. The owner said he wasn't surprised, because in his 30 years of working there, he had definitely seen people walking around while he was alone. Paranormal Hospital Stories. This story comes from a nursing home in Southwest Virginia that is believed to be haunted. If there are any paranormal investigators who are watching this near that area, you might want to check this place out. One worker saw what she describes as a shadow-like figure enter the room of one of the patients. She immediately checked on the patient, but found her deceased. Other workers in the nursing home have also seen this happen just before a patient is about to die. But there's even more paranormal activity happening in this nursing home. At least 20 different residents have refused to stay in one of the rooms. They all described seeing two small children watching them. The last incident involves a resident who brought his little black dog to live with him at the facility. After the resident died, the dog died shortly after. Now to this day, many residents complain to staff about seeing a little black dog run through their rooms and keeping them awake at night. Shadow figures, ghost children, and a ghost dog. I'm staying away from that place. Scariest things police have seen. Have you ever thought that old abandoned boats were creepy? You might after this video. This story comes from a security guard at a shipyard in Channelview, Texas. One night he patrolled a shipyard that was supposed to be empty. At about 2 a.m. he saw a man working on one of the boats that was in the repair section. He told him to leave, but the man completely ignored the guard. The guard climbed the ladder to get to the top of the boat to detain the man. When he got to the top, the man was gone. It was like he completely vanished into thin air. He searched all around but couldn't find the man. The boat was too high off the ground for anyone to safely jump off. In the morning after his shift, the guard spoke with the manager and told him what he saw. The manager said he didn't have anyone working that night. But years prior, someone had been working on that very boat and accidentally fell to their death. It is now believed that the boat is haunted by that man's ghost. Paranormal Hospital Stories. This story was sent by a hospital security officer in Northern California. One night he received a call from housekeeping staff who said they could see an elderly female patient in a hospital gown standing outside. By the time he arrived, she was gone. He went throughout the entire hospital with the description the housekeeping staff had given him. After talking to every department, no one recognized the patient. He also realized, according to the hospital records, there were no female patients in the hospital at that time. He looked at cameras and saw housekeeping looking and pointing in the direction where they said the patient was. But in the video there was nothing there. Oddly enough, while housekeeping was looking at that area, a motion light suddenly turned on. Scary first responder stories. This story was sent to me by the daughter of a firefighter in Baltimore, Maryland, who was a battalion chief. On October 17th, 1980, there was a huge fire that spread to multiple buildings. One of those buildings was an abandoned hotel that had been damaged by a fire before. A photographer on scene told the firefighters he saw a woman standing in one of the windows waving for help. It was common to find homeless in abandoned buildings to take shelter from the cold. They sent a rescue team in there, but the floor where the woman was seen had collapsed. They couldn't find any remains or any trace of her, but the photographer had definitely taken a picture and seen the woman there. The battalion chief later investigated and pulled up the file from the original fire. It turns out a woman had died during that first fire in the very room the photographer saw her in. Apparently, that photograph is locked away somewhere on file in Maryland. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, episode 55. This story is from a police officer in South Africa. He responded to an alarm call at a school with two of his partners. They searched the campus and found an open bathroom door. The door had a padlock on it that was open. It was the only locked bathroom on the campus. They all three walked in. Each had an uneasy feeling, but the bathroom was empty. They left, shut the door, and secured the padlock. As they were walking away, one officer realized he left his flashlight in the bathroom. They turned back to see if they could get inside to get it. They walked up to the door, and it flew open on its own. The padlock landed on the floor next to them. They decided the flashlight was not worth it and they left. The next morning, they talked to school officials about what happened and why the bathroom was locked. They said an 8-year-old girl died in that bathroom years before. Since her death, that door has been replaced several times because it opens and closes violently. The officer never found his flashlight. He did find small scratch marks on his leg that looked like they were caused by a child. Paranormal Hospital Stories. Nurses on night shift, stay away from this video. This story is from a nurse at a small community hospital in Portland, Oregon. One night, she sat at a computer that faced a dead-end hallway that had 6 patient rooms lining it. It was a slow night, so there were very few patients in those 6 rooms. She was by herself and had the feeling like someone was watching her. She looked up and could see an elderly man standing in the doorway of one of those rooms. She was startled to see him because 1, that room was supposed to be empty, and 2, he wasn't one of her patients on that floor. She looked down for a moment to log off the computer, and when she looked up, he was gone. There was no way he could have walked down that hallway and past her without her seeing him. She got up and checked the room, but he wasn't there. She checked the other rooms and couldn't find him. Finally, she got with the hospital's charge nurse, and they did a patient count. No patients were missing that night. Scary stories sent by you. Do not watch this if you are home alone. This is another story from Toronto, Canada, sent by one of my followers. When the sender of this story was young, his school had late starts on Wednesdays. He was in his room when everyone else in his house left for work. He heard noises coming from downstairs and thought a family member had returned home. But things got very strange. Suddenly, he heard a huge stomp and the sound of someone running up the stairs. The steps were so loud that it sounded like a bowling ball being dropped on each step. He was so scared he just froze with fear behind the door. He was able to call his aunt who lived across the street. She came over and checked the house, but there was no one else there. Years later, the sender of this story spoke with his mother about the incident. She had also had paranormal encounters at the house, so she called a priest to investigate. They looked around the house, and out in the garden they found the cause of the issue. Someone had buried 3 witch totems to curse their property. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, episode 54. Imagine being alone and having this encounter. An abandoned apartment complex in California was known for being a high-crime area. The apartment was cleared and scheduled for demolition. The sender of this story, a security officer, was assigned to guard the complex at night. One night he patrolled the outside of the complex. Suddenly, he heard a scream coming from inside. He saw a light on in a window of the 3rd floor. He looked closer and saw a woman standing in the window looking at him. He went up to investigate and saw it was apartment number 329. He yelled to whoever was inside the apartment to come out, but no one answered. He went inside, but found no one there. The light was still on, and he looked at the window where he saw the woman. He noticed something odd. There was what appeared to be a blood stain underneath the window. Just then the light turned off and the door slammed shut. He ran outside the apartment and found no one there. He did some research and found out a woman was brutally murdered by her husband in apartment 329. Paranormal Hospital Stories Episode 2. This story is from a nurse in Ontario, Canada. She works at a nursing home that was converted from an old hospital. Her coworker told her about a paranormal experience she had a year ago. The coworker was working one night when she heard a noise coming from the hallway. She looked up in the mirror at the nurse's station and saw a patient wearing an old hospital gown standing in the hallway. The gown wasn't like any they gave the patients currently. The coworker got up to check on the patient, and when she went around the corner, there was no one there. The sender of this story has not experienced anything like that until just a few weeks ago. One night she went to the basement to put her uniform in the laundry. This basement used to be the hospital's morgue. When she entered the tunnel portion of the basement, she heard a voice. It whispered, "Help me, please." The nurse said, "Hello?" and looked around, but she was completely alone. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 53. This is a story that made international news in Scotland in 2016. Police officers were called to a residence by a homeowner. The house was occupied by a woman and her young son. She was in fear because objects around the house had been moving on their own. Police officers originally thought this was going to be a mental health issue, but they were wrong. They arrived and spoke with the homeowner about what was happening. During that initial conversation, one officer heard a noise coming from the kitchen and went to investigate. As she walked in, the oven door slammed shut with no one around it. After that, a kitchen towel flew past her head like someone had thrown it. They called for a supervisor who arrived at the house. He walked in and observed the sofa and lampshades moving on their own. The family's chihuahua randomly appeared on a 7-foot hedge. Police determined there was nothing they could do to help the family, so a priest was called to bless the house. You can read more about this online. Scary Story Sent by You, Episode 1, Part 2. One day my boss at the yard called me in to talk to me about leaving the lights on. You see, the bus yard had these huge lights that illuminated the entire yard that cost a lot of money to keep on. I thought I had turned them off, but I apologized and told him it wouldn't happen again. A few days later it happened again. He called me in and I told him I swore I turned them off. The next day I got to the yard to clean a bus. I finished cleaning at around 3 a.m., but I was scheduled to clean another one that had not yet arrived. I turned off the lights and I left to go get some fast food while I waited for the bus. When I returned, the lights were on. At first I thought this meant the bus was back, but it wasn't. It was still gone. I looked around the locked yard and I didn't see anyone. I checked the cameras and watched the post where the only light switch for the lights was at. The light turned on by itself with absolutely no one around. I told my boss about the incident and showed him the video. He was confused like me, but believed me that it wasn't my fault. Scary Story Sent by You, Episode 1. I figured I'd start out the series with one of my own personal stories. When I was 16 years old, I cleaned buses for a charter bus company. I had to clean the buses whenever they got in, so it was usually late at night or early before school. The newest bus in the fleet had just been purchased. The rumor was it was cheap because it had hit and killed a man who stepped out in front of it. I had several unexplainable things happen while that bus was around. One night, I was at the yard alone. I cleaned a bus at the far end of the yard and walked back to the office to go to the bathroom. I passed the front of every bus on my way and everything was normal. When I went back outside, the windshield wipers on that one bus were moving back and forth at full speed. I checked the cameras and no one entered that bus. The windshield wipers just started going by themselves. Paranormal Hospital Stories, Episode 1. This story was sent to me by a former ER tech in Corpus Christi, Texas. One night a few years ago at a hospital, she was walking back to her area after dropping off a patient. She saw an elderly man in a patient's gown standing by the elevator. She started asking him questions to see if he was okay and see if he was a patient on that floor. He just stared at her and didn't answer. She turned the corner and looked down the hallway to see if there was any staff nearby that could help her, but she didn't see anyone. She turned back to the elevator and the man was gone. She was worried about him, so she called security to help find him. While they were looking, the ER tech gave a description of the man to the nurses on that floor, and they didn't recognize him. The security guards invited her back to look at the surveillance video. In the video, the ER tech was standing at the elevator alone. She said in the video, it looked like she was talking to someone who wasn't there. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, episode 52. This story is from a correctional officer at a prison in Pendleton, Oregon. At about 2 a.m. on a graveyard shift, an officer was alone at his desk. He looked up to observe the dark cell block and saw an inmate standing in the middle of the room. The officer told the man to get back inside the cell. He refused and didn't move. The officer radioed for a sergeant to assist him. The sergeant arrived and also ordered the man to return to the cell, but he continued to refuse. The sergeant began to approach the inmate with his pepper spray drawn. The sergeant told the officer to turn on the lights. He got closer and closer to the inmate. As soon as the lights turned on, the inmate disappeared. There was no one there, but they had both seen a figure. You see, this prison has a lot of history. It used to be a state mental hospital. When it was converted to a prison, there were 100 unmarked jars of cremated remains found in tunnels underneath. Scary First Responder Stories, Episode 5. This story comes from the historic Fire Station 2 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Carl Kane was promoted to fire chief in 1950. He and his family lived at the station for several years. Unfortunately, Chief Kane committed suicide in 1964. In the years following his death, strange occurrences have led the firefighters of Station 2 to believe it is haunted. There have been reports of doors opening, footsteps, writings on the wall, and sightings of a mysterious figure. One firefighter explained his encounter in 2000. He was in bed at around 2 a.m. He heard footsteps approach him from behind, between his bunk and the wall. At first he thought he slept through a call, but he looked over to his lieutenant, who was still asleep. The radio was also silent. He could hear and feel the presence of someone standing over him. He slowly turned to look at who it was, only to find no one there. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Episode 51. This story was sent to me on Instagram by the son of a police officer in the Manchester Police Force. There is a 300-year-old abandoned mansion that is still fitted with an alarm system to keep out intruders. One night the alarm went off and this officer met up with the K9 unit in front of the house. The dog was described as being very tough and not scared of a thing, but it refused to go near the house. The officer searched the entire inside and found nothing but dead crows and dead rats. After the house was clear, they went outside to check on the dog. It was whining and staring up at the house. The officers followed the dog's line of sight and saw it was looking at an attic window. Inside the window, the officers could see a man wearing Victorian-era clothing staring back at them. For a moment, they stared at each other until the man took a step backwards and out of sight. The officer rushed back inside, looking for the man. Again, no one was found. Scary First Responder Stories, Episode 4. This is a well-known story from Chicago. On April 18, 1924, a firefighter named Frank Levy was washing a window at the fire station. He paused for a moment and put his hand on the glass. He told one of his coworkers he had the feeling he was going to die that day. At that moment, a call came in, and his crew responded to a fire that had broken out in an office building. While fighting the fire, a wall collapsed and tragically killed 8 firemen. Frank Levy was one of those men. The next day, one of the surviving firemen looked at the window Frank had been washing the day before. There was an unusual stain that appeared to be a handprint. No matter what they did to try to remove it, the handprint remained. They even had someone take a look at the fingerprints and confirm the handprint belonged to Frank. On April 18, 1944, a careless paperboy threw a stack of newspapers through that window. The window shattered exactly 20 years after Frank's passing. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 50. This story comes from a police officer in Japan. It happened at the Aokigahara Forest. One day while on patrol, a police officer heard a woman cry for help near the edge of the forest. He rushed in to assist, and he found her. She told him she was out enjoying a hike when she got lost and asked for his help to find a way out. The police officer showed her the way. He noticed a unique scarf the woman was wearing, and he complimented her on it. She told the officer her mother made it for her by hand when she was a little girl. Once they got to the edge of the forest, they said goodbye. The next day, the officer responded to a report of hikers coming across a body in the forest. He responded and was in shock with what he saw. The badly decomposed body wore that same scarf the woman the previous day had worn. The woman had been dead for weeks. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 49. This story was sent to me on Instagram by a police officer who worked for the Watervliet Arsenal Police Department in New York. There was a structure there they called Building 10. One night, he and a partner were locking up the building because it housed the base commander's office. The police officer locked one of the doors, and when he turned around, he saw someone run down a breezeway. This was the only staircase and entrance to the basement area of the building. He called out to his partner and let him know that someone ran away from him. They searched the entire basement, but it was completely empty. Maybe just one of those trick of the eyes. A few days later, that officer drove by the building again. He looked up at one of the attic windows and saw a person staring at him. He shined his spotlight at the person, and they vanished. Needless to say, that officer never went in that building alone again. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 48. This story was sent to me by the son of a police officer in London. One night on patrol, he got a call about a car that had crashed in the middle of the forest. It ran off the road and off the edge of a bank. The officer arrived at the road where the call came out and got behind a van that was in front of him. He could see the emergency lights ahead of him from the emergency personnel who were already on scene. Suddenly, he heard a loud screech, and the van slid from the roadway, down the bank, and crashed into a tree. The police officer stopped to investigate. When he got out of his patrol vehicle, he heard a loud metallic scratching noise coming from the van. He ran down the bank to help the occupants of the vehicle, but couldn't find anyone inside. What he did find, however, was what appeared to be deep claw marks on the side of the van. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 47. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Iowa who wished to be anonymous. Several years ago, a young woman went missing, and there were extensive searches for her body. This officer volunteered from out of the area to search for her. After spending the whole day searching, he and another officer went for a run. As they were cooling down after the jog, they heard a voice. It was someone asking for help. There was no yelling, and the voice remained calm. They shouted out for the individual and tried to look for who was speaking. They couldn't find anyone. Several days later, and after about a month of being missing, the woman's killer was found. He confessed to killing her weeks prior and led law enforcement to where he hid her body. The spot was within a half a mile of where the officers heard the voice asking for help. Scary First Responder Stories, Part 3. This story was sent to me by a firefighter. He and his team used an abandoned church building for training. This is when firefighters intentionally set fire to something and train how to put it out. After the church was mostly burned down, the firefighters walked around the interior. One firefighter felt something touch his back. When he turned around, there was nothing behind him. They later came across a burnt bookshelf that was partially blocking a staircase leading to a basement they didn't initially know was there. They moved the bookshelf but weren't able to go down because the building was starting to collapse. One firefighter yelled down to see how far the echo carried. Immediately after he yelled, a voice responded. All the firefighters heard a ghastly scream come from deep inside the basement. They left and never discussed it again. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 45. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Cairo, Egypt. One night, this officer was stationed at a desert checkpoint. At the end of the shift, he left the checkpoint with his partners. They were about 150 kilometers away from the nearest city or town. In this area, it is common for drug dealers to hide just off the side of the road and signal to cars to buy drugs from them. While driving, the officers saw a man wearing a jalabia just standing off the side of the road. They stopped to investigate. The man ran up and over a sand berm and out of sight. The officers pursued and went over the sand berm about 4 seconds after the man. When they reached the top, they couldn't see him anywhere. What they did see, however, was what appeared to be a hairless dog running away from them on all fours. I've been getting a lot of stories about strange creatures lately. Scary First Responder Stories, Part 2. This was sent to me by a paramedic. At around 3 a.m., her and her partner responded to a residence regarding a woman with chest pains. They showed up at her house and approached the door. Through the window, they could see a young woman sitting at a table with an elderly woman. Neither of them moved or said a word. The paramedics knocked on the door, and the young woman answered. She said she wasn't feeling well and went to sit back down at the table, but the older woman wasn't there. They asked her if anyone else was home, and she said no. She requested to go to the hospital and went upstairs to get some belongings. The paramedics tried to use their radios, but they wouldn't work. The woman immediately came back downstairs and she had a completely different demeanor. She refused care and told them they had to leave immediately. They left the house. As they drove away, they looked at the house again, and through the window they could see the elderly woman sitting back at the table with the young woman. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 44. This story was sent to me by Mike, who went on a ride-along with deputies in Manatee County, Florida. Mike and the deputies were in a wooded area and responded to a call. In an opening in the woods, they saw a humanoid creature with pink skin. It ran out of sight, and they couldn't find the creature anywhere. Sounds like something kind of hard to believe, right? This isn't the only sighting, however. There have been multiple 911 calls about people having seen this creature. There's even a social media group where locals have talked about their sightings. In one post, a lady talks about seeing a creature with floating flesh skin, no facial features, no hair, and being incredibly fast. What could it be? Scary First Responder Stories, Episode 1. This story comes from a firefighter in Reeltown, Alabama. It was a foggy night when this firefighter responded to a single vehicle accident. The call came from a vehicle linked with the 911 call alert system. They searched the area but couldn't find the vehicle due to the fog. Suddenly, a woman dressed in a bright yellow shirt showed up out of the fog, standing in the middle of the road. The firefighters slammed on their brakes, stopped, and got out. She pointed them to where the car was off the roadway. There was a man trapped inside who was unconscious. The firefighters were able to get him out, rescue him, and save his life. However, they couldn't find the mystery woman. They spoke to the survivor about his experience, and he told them after he crashed, he saw his wife, who was deceased. She comforted him and told him she would go for help. The man said she wore a bright yellow shirt. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 43. This was sent to me by a police officer in Three Forks, Montana. In the town, there is a historic hotel built in 1882. Officers frequently respond for strange noise complaints. One evening, this officer responded there for a call about a suspicious person. A bartender said she was getting ready to close for the night when she heard something strange upstairs. She investigated, and in a storage space upstairs, she saw a man dressed in a white coat and wearing a chef's hat. She was terrified and called 911. When the officer responded, he too could hear noises coming from upstairs. He went to the storage space and saw the same man. The man ran into an adjacent room and the officer followed. When the officer turned the corner, the room was empty. There was no other way for the man to exit the room. The officer could tell that the boxes in the storage space had been moved because of lines left in the dust. Pretty freaky. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 41. This story was sent to me by a corrections officer in Arizona. He worked at a jail in Kingman, which has an old legend about a little girl which haunts its halls. Her name is Delilah. One night, this officer was working alone in a control room after the facility lockdown. While looking at the control panel, the officer saw in the corner of his eye what appeared to be someone's head and shoulders looking over the panel at him. He looked over the panel and saw nothing. About 30 minutes later, the officer felt something tug on the back of his uniform. He also heard a soft giggle. When he turned around, there was no one there. He told the corporal about what happened, and he responded, "Well, I guess Delilah likes you." The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 40. I love paranormal stories from different cultures. This story was sent to me by the son of a police officer in Australia. The officer was on patrol with his partner, who was an Aboriginal elder. They were in the Northern Territory about 3 hours from civilization. When they stopped, the officer noticed on the side of a road a lot of footprints. The footprints looked like they belonged to children and led towards a mountain off in the distance. The officer asked his Aboriginal partner what he thought, and he said, "I have no clue." When they got back to the station, the officer talked to his supervisor about what happened. The supervisor knew exactly what he was talking about. He spoke of a traditional indigenous story about tiny people who lived in the mountains who would come down and steal from locals. He also said the indigenous people were not allowed to talk about them, and his partner would deny what they saw. Sure enough, when the officer spoke to his partner again about what happened, the partner denied ever seeing footprints in the first place. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 39. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Texas. This took place at Laredo College, which is made up from an old military fort, and near the river that separates the US and Mexico. Late at night, the officer was watching the road next to the river. He saw 4 people marching in a single file line across the road and down to the river. The officer investigated to see what was going on, but he couldn't follow them because he couldn't find any footprints in the dirt. He made his way down to the river and still couldn't find anyone. He said there was no way for 4 individuals to walk that direction and not leave some kind of trace. He called for assistance and a senior officer arrived. He explained what happened to him, and the officer laughed. He said, "You saw ghosts from the old fort. Back in the day, it was common for soldiers to march down to the river together to fetch water. Apparently their ghosts walk the same path today." The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 38. This story was sent to me by a police officer in Missouri. An elderly lady passed away alone in her home. This officer and his partner arrived to conduct a death investigation. The officers waited for the county coroner to arrive in the same room where the body was found. While waiting, a broom leaning on the back of the couch fell to the ground. It startled them, but brooms fall down all the time, right? A few seconds after the broom fell, a small hand exercising device fell from off the dining room table. But the device was originally in the center of the table. There wasn't a draft in the house, and no explanation as to why the objects fell. But all these objects fell in the same room where the deceased was found. What do you think? The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 37. This video, one of the creepiest I've ever seen, was sent to me by a police officer in South Carolina. He responded to a residence because of motion being picked up in an upstairs bedroom. He got there and the house was completely secure. The homeowner shows up, lets them inside. They don't find anyone in there, and nothing was disturbed. He pulls up video from an indoor surveillance camera, and this is what they see. Come to find out, the residence was previously owned by a family that had passed away from natural causes, except one small boy. There was never a death record for him, but he went missing after his 9th birthday. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Christmas Edition. I've been saving this one especially for today. On a snowy Christmas Eve, a police officer pulled to the side of the road to take a dinner break. As he was eating, he felt and heard something hit his car. He immediately got out to investigate what it was. In the snow, he noticed multiple footprints all around his patrol vehicle. There were even footprints left over the tire tracks his vehicle left when he pulled over. He tried following the footprints to see where they went, but they didn't lead anywhere. They were just around his car and that was it. He counted 5 distinct shoe prints that looked like they belonged to children. That's when the officer realized where he was at. About 10 miles from his location was the town of Fayetteville. In 1945, 5 children went missing in a house fire on Christmas Eve. Their bodies were never found. Merry Christmas. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 36. This story was sent to me by a deputy in Ohio. One night he responded to a house to assist an elderly lady. The lady called and complained about her neighbor's horses whinnying, neighing, running around at all hours of the night. The lady also had dementia and was the only one living in the area, so the deputy thought the complaint was due to her mental status. Yet the deputy made the decision to investigate just in case. The neighbor's house had been abandoned for 10 years and he wanted to check to see if anyone was squatting inside. He looked around the inside of the house, which had no doors or windows. He found no one inside. As he checked the back side of the house, he noticed a crumbling barn on the property. As he walked closer to the abandoned barn, he heard, clear as day, the sound of horses walking, neighing, and whinnying. He left the location, and I don't blame him because I wouldn't want to mess with some demon horses either. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 35. This story was sent to me by a Louisiana police officer. Thanks, buddy. He told me this encounter made him believe in the paranormal. About 2 weeks ago, this officer and his partner were dispatched to a break-in. They arrived and could clearly hear movement inside the house. They went inside, and in the back room, they heard objects moving and heard a television turn on. They made commands for the person inside to come out with their hands up. At that moment, the television turned off and the door flew open. There was no one there, but the officers could hear faint footsteps walking past them in the hallway. They searched the room and there was no one there. They searched the rest of the house, and in the living room, the officer felt something pull on his ear. But there was no one there. When the homeowner showed up, they explained to him what happened. The homeowner said his father used to live there, and he was a violent man who used to twist the kids' ears a lot, but he died 2 weeks ago. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 34. In 1997, a woman purchased a house that used to be used as a hospital. She lived there by herself until there was a home invasion robbery. The criminals broke in, tied her to a chair, and brutally murdered her. Years later, a static 911 call came from the house. 2 officers responded. When they arrived, they found the house was empty. The officers asked dispatch to call the number back, but the line was disconnected. A few minutes later, dispatch called the officers and told them to come back to the station immediately. The dispatcher was listening to the call and decided to turn the frequency all the way up. In the audio, a muffled voice could be heard. The voice said, "Help me, help me. They are going to kill me." This story was sent to me by Cody Flynn, whose father was one of the officers that responded that night. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 33. This story is from the Honolulu Police Department. One rookie officer spoke about patrolling the Poly Lookout one night. She was assigned to lock the gates along the highway. She locked the first gate and then drove along the highway to the second gate. She saw a strange woman dressed in white walking on the side of the road. What do cops do? They investigate. So she pulled over to ask the woman if she was all right. The officer looked down to roll down the window, looked back up, and the woman was gone. The rookie had an eerie feeling like she wasn't alone and looked in the rearview mirror. The woman in white was in her back seat. The officer remembered her grandmother telling her to remain calm if she ever encountered a spirit. The officer continued driving to her destination and started talking to the spirit in order to stay calm. The woman never replied. The rookie got out of her vehicle to lock the second gate, and when she went back to her car, the spirit was gone. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 32. This is another story from near Espanola, New Mexico. A detective from Espanola was driving a rural mountain road to Chama, which has a history of witchcraft. At about sunset, the detective saw a wolf on a small hill on the side of the road. He had never seen a wolf in that area before, so he got ready to take a picture. The detective saw the wolf look at him, stand up on his hind legs, and run down the opposite side of the mountain, out of sight. This story was sent to me by Jeremy Betancourt. Thank you, Jeremy. He said that this detective was a very serious guy and wouldn't make something like this up. Scary Things Police Have Seen, Part 31. Sometimes the scariest things aren't paranormal. This story is the point of view of a gas station convenience store worker. A suspicious-looking man came in, walked around the store, went back out, pumped his gas, and left without paying. The woman was able to get the license plate number, and she called the police to report what had happened. Less than an hour later, a police officer went to the convenience store to speak with her. The police officer asked her to identify the man, which she did. It turns out the man she had seen was wanted for 2 murders. He had murdered a convenience store clerk after kidnapping her and robbing her. The police officer told her that him walking in the store, all suspicious-like, was the exact same thing he did when he murdered the other woman. Needless to say, the writer of the story feels very lucky he didn't do to her what he had done before. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen. This mustache. Right here. What do you think? Yay? Nay? The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 30. In 2016, in North London, police did a death investigation at a residence. A 26-year-old male was bound down for 3 days without medical attention. According to the deceased family, he was acting strange and aggressive. He attacked family members, talked about cutting off his own body parts, and complained about a serpent being inside of him. The BBC reported saying the family then set about attempting to cure the male through restraint and prayer over the next 3 days. The deceased brother said, "It's clear that thing was in him. What we believed was a demon because it was not natural. It was clearly trying to kill him. We had to restrain him for himself. It was clear if we didn't restrain him, he could have tried to harm people in our family." When police arrived, the brother was attempting to resurrect him by chanting. The family members were charged with manslaughter but found not guilty. Weird. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 29. In 2014, the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department in Iowa responded to a house in reference to a man that had been stabbed in the chest. The place where it happened was pretty famous. It's known as the Villisca Axe Murder House. It's supposed to be one of the most haunted places in America, where 2 adults and 6 children were killed. The murderer was never found. But in 2014, a group of friends who were doing a paranormal investigation stayed at the house, which is now a tourist attraction. At about 12:45 a.m., around the same time the murders took place, the victim radioed to his friends asking for help. His friends found him with a stab wound in his chest. The victim did recover, and it was written as a self-inflicted wound, but he has never come out to speak about what happened that night. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 28. This story comes to us from an armed security guard that worked for the Department of Homeland Security in New Mexico. The government bought an abandoned town called Plias to use for training. The writer of the story said on his first day of work, he spent the entire shift checking doors with his trainer. He came to an old medical facility that had an open back door. They cleared the building, didn't find anything, and then went back to the back door to exit. As soon as he put his hand on the door, he heard a baby cry from within the facility. They rushed back in, and sure enough, they didn't find anything. They both brushed it off, thinking it might be an old rusty air conditioner or something like that. A week later, the writer of the story was now on patrol by himself, checking the buildings. He came across the medical facility, and all the doors were locked. As he walked away, he heard the same baby cry again, but this time over his own radio. Scary Things Police Have Seen, Part 27. This one comes to us from a former police officer in Maine. The officer received a call from dispatch from a woman who said she heard Native American drumming coming from her basement. Obviously, the cop thought she was a little crazy. She arrived at the house at about 11 o'clock at night. She walked up to the house, and as soon as the homeowner opened the door, the cop could hear the faint drumming coming from inside the house. The homeowner asked, "Do you hear it?" The cop thought someone was messing with her, so she went to the basement to investigate. As she approached the basement door, the drumming got louder and louder, and she could even hear chanting. As soon as she opened the basement door, the drumming and chanting stopped completely. She investigated the basement. There was no one down there, no speakers, recorders, anything like that. This is why you don't build houses on Indian burial grounds. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 26. This one is super random, but is actually posted on the CIA's website. Back in 1986, the writer of the story was working the agency's security protective force and making security rounds. It was nighttime and there was supposed to be no one around. He heard a basketball bouncing inside the gym. As he approached the entrance to the gym, it was very obvious that there was someone in there shooting baskets. When he entered the room, the sound stopped, so he turned on the lights. There was absolutely no one inside the gym. All he saw was a basketball just sitting at the free throw line. He didn't hear any footsteps running away, nothing. Pretty creepy, and I find it so weird that it's posted on the CIA's website. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 24. One night, 2 officers responded to an alarm call at an elementary school. They arrived, saw all doors were locked, and left. 20 minutes later, they get another activation. They check the doors, and this time a maintenance store on the outside of the school was open. They find no one, secure it, and leave again. Another 20 minutes goes by, and they get another activation. They called for a key holder to respond to the school to let them in so they could check the inside. While they waited, they split up and watched each side of the school. No one exited or entered. The custodian showed up and let them inside the school. At around 3 a.m., the 3 of them walked through the school, checking doors, classrooms, and hallways. They found an open janitor's closet with the light on. Inside the small room, they found no one. When they looked down on the ground, however, they found the bare footprint of a child in some freshly spilled water. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 23, continued. In the victim's interview, she told the detective her ex-boyfriend had the knife up to her throat and was going to kill her. He got distracted for some reason and ran out of the apartment. She had no explanation why. The suspect was caught later that day and interviewed, where he confessed to everything. When asked about the knife to his ex-girlfriend's throat, he said, "I swear to God I was going to cut her throat open, but I thought I heard a knock at the door and thought it was the police. Once I saw it was clear, I ran outside." The suspect is now serving life in prison, and the mom and toddler are safe. That day, someone protected the toddler from seeing something horrific and protected the mother's life. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 23. Here's another one that's a little more on the supernatural paranormal side than it is creepy and scary, but it'll give you goosebumps. A detective wrote about an experience when he interviewed a young mother and her toddler. She told him about her boyfriend violently raping her at knife point. The detective, who specialized in sex crimes, wrote that it was one of the most violent and sadistic cases he had ever seen. Part of the investigation required him to speak with the toddler, who was present during the entire incident. During the interview, the toddler recalled their father getting angry and hitting the mom. Then the toddler said, "A nice woman showed up and she couldn't see past the nice woman. She held her, told her they were both going to be safe, and sang her a song in a different language." The toddler said the nice woman went over to the door and knocked. This story's kind of long, so head over to the next video to finish the story. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 22. Even though the story's pretty sad, it's also pretty incredible. Officers responded to a call about a father who went crazy and decided to shoot his family. He killed his wife and started looking for his 5-year-old son. The boy ran outside and was trying to hide on the side of the house behind some trash cans. The father eventually found him and at point blank unloaded almost an entire magazine on the boy. When the officers arrived, they found the boy in shock, hiding right where the dad found him. There wasn't a wound on his body. There were bullet holes all over the side of the house around the boy. When they questioned the boy about what happened, he said, "An angel was in front of me with a shield, and he saved me. He pushed the gun away from me." Not a scary story, but pretty incredible. The Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 21. In 2007, ABC News documented a series of phone calls to families with terrifyingly specific death threats. The unidentified callers knew exactly where the families were and what they were wearing. The callers would call all throughout the night and make threats to kill their children, their grandparents, and even their pets. The callers would even send families recordings from their private conversations. One was even with a police detective. One police department tried to investigate by tracing the callers. The calls were traced back to the victims' own phones, even when the phones were turned off. There were never any suspects found or arrests made. Some people think it was hackers, other people think it was a hoax. What do you think? Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 20. This is another one that really creeps me out. While working at night, a police officer came across a vehicle parked in an empty church parking lot. He figured it was just kids having a late night Bible study. He drove up next to the vehicle and found no one inside. He pulled his unit around to the back of the car so he could run the license plate to see if it was a stolen vehicle that was dumped in the parking lot. The officer looked down as he ran the plate, looked back up, and he saw someone sitting in the front seat staring at him through the rearview mirror. This is something that cops really pay attention to, that you're trained to observe on traffic stops. He had that, "oh crap, I missed something" moment, and he drove up next to the car to talk to the driver. When he drove back up next to the car, there was no one there. The officer said it freaked him out so much, he took off. And when he went back the next night, the vehicle was gone. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 19. This creepy story comes to us from a police officer in St. Louis, Missouri. He was dispatched to a Victorian-style house in reference to a burglary alarm going off. The owner was out of town and there was an open door. The officers went inside the house, and when they entered, the door slammed behind them. Thinking it might have just been the wind or a pressure change, they decided to keep searching the house. They searched the entire house without finding anything, but when they went back downstairs, they heard a noise. The faucets on all the sinks downstairs were turned on, and the water was running. They never found an explanation about what happened, and I don't think any of them returned there ever again. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 18. This one's pretty bizarre. A police officer made a traffic stop on a man in a vehicle. The police officer spoke with the man and didn't really notice anything out of the ordinary. When the officer returned to his vehicle, he noticed a female officer standing next to him. He didn't recognize her, and he didn't call for backup. The only thing she said to him was, "He has a gun in the back seat." The officer cautiously approached the vehicle again, arrested the man, and sure enough, found a gun in the back of the car. After this, the female officer was nowhere to be found. It turns out the man he arrested was wanted for murdering a female police officer years before. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 16. This story is about a mother's love that was so strong, it transcended the veil between life and death. A mother and her infant daughter were driving near the Spanish Fork River in Utah. The mother lost control of the vehicle and plunged into the river. Approximately 14 hours later, a fisherman found the vehicle and notified emergency responders. When first responders arrived, they saw no signs of life and figured it was just an abandoned vehicle. As they got closer to observe the wreck, they heard a woman's voice yelling for help. When they flipped over the vehicle, they found that the mother was clearly deceased, but they found the baby girl unconscious but alive. The baby girl was treated for hypothermia and was later found in the investigation that the mother died on impact. All the first responders swore they heard the voice of a call for help. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 15. 2 Oregon State troopers were dispatched to a call about a man holding a gun to a woman's head. When the officers arrived, they found a woman crying over and over again saying, "He shot me, he shot me." The officers checked her and couldn't find any apparent injuries and informed her she hadn't been shot. The woman gave officers her name but refused any help from them. She declined an offer by the officers to get a ride somewhere else. Since she refused any kind of help, the officers had no choice but to leave her. Back at the station, one of the officers looked up the woman's name. He discovered that a woman with the same name was shot and killed by her husband years earlier. Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 14. A police officer wrote about his experience when responding to an elderly lady's house. The lady insisted there was a young girl running around her property at night. The officer first checked outside the house and didn't find anything. The officer went back inside the house to talk to the elderly lady who was petrified. The lady told him she's inside the house. Soon after, the cop saw a girl about 13 years old run from one side of the house to the other. He told her to stop, but it seemed like she disappeared into thin air. The lady yelled to him, saying that the girl was now in the front yard. Sure enough, the officer saw her standing out in the rain. He tried to stop her, but again she disappeared without an explanation. He searched all over the property, but couldn't find her anywhere. A few months later, the officer found out the old lady had passed away, and the new tenants that moved in started calling about a 13-year-old girl on their property. Scariest things police have seen, part 13. An officer responded to a residence in reference to a psychiatric issue. The homeowner told the officer her son had taken drugs and was convinced that whenever he entered his room, he saw a man wearing a World War II uniform hanging from the ceiling. When the officer talked to the son directly, he told him he was ordered by an evil spirit not to enter the room because it was his father hanging from the ceiling. The officer entered the room and didn't find anything. A veteran officer later responded and told the young officer that he had been to that house years before. What he responded to was a call about an old man wearing a World War II veteran uniform who had hung himself. The initial officer had no idea about the previous call. Scariest things police have seen, part 12. This one is from my best friend who's also a cop. I'm gonna read his report word for word. It's kind of silly, but kind of creepy too. I arrived on scene and immediately noticed a strange feel to the area. Numerous dogs were barking and a single loud howl echoed from somewhere nearby. With shivers running down my spine, I approached the incident location. I spoke to the reporting party through the door, who was terrified and refused to come out. He stated a dog larger than he'd ever seen with blue glowing eyes was tearing apart the fence outside of his bedroom window. On the east end of the property, I located numerous very large paw prints. At numerous points on the top of the 8-foot wood fence, there were bite and deep claw marks. The fence had been ripped apart in numerous spots. I am unaware of any animal that would be able to chew on the top of an 8-foot fence. At this time, it is unknown what caused the damage. I was unable to locate any animal matching the reporting party's description. Scariest things police have seen, part 11. This one comes to us from a police officer in Nebraska, and let me tell you, this story freaked me out. One night the officer was checking on an abandoned house that was often hit by thieves who stole the copper wire inside. He checked on it twice that night. First time at 7 p.m., everything was fine. 2 hours later, he noticed an open back door, but he couldn't see any footprints in the snow. He told dispatch he was investigating the open door and he went inside. All of a sudden he heard a thump come from upstairs and he thought he heard the sound of kids playing. He went upstairs to investigate and he heard the thump several more times and the sound of laughter get stronger and stronger. He entered the bedroom where he heard the sounds and didn't find anyone inside. What he did find, however, was a ripped out page of a children's book with the drawing of a police officer on it. He left the house and he never went back. Like and follow for more. Scariest things police have seen, part 10. This is an audio recording from 1981 by a police officer who saw a UFO. Listen for yourself.
Yes, all it is now is just an orange glow. That's all I can see. Just an orange glow. Because the sun is coming up. Better not be. It's awful early. Early for the sun paper, Joe. I don't think the sun would just be in that one spot. It goes up to a higher vantage point, so you tell us what it does. Listen.
Freaky. Scariest things police have seen, part 9. About 10 years ago, a couple repeatedly called police about hearing footsteps in their home in Imperial, Missouri. The responding officer had been there twice and found nothing, and figured the third time would be just the same. When he got there, he found an open sliding glass door, and something had set off the motion light. The officer looked all around the outside of the house and couldn't find any footprints in the snow that would have caused the motion light to be set off. As he interviewed the couple as to what happened, he heard creaking in the floorboards upstairs like someone was walking on them. He looked around again and couldn't find anything. The officer said, out of his 27 years of policing, it was the creepiest thing he had ever experienced. Scariest things police have seen, Part 8. This one comes to us from Espanola, New Mexico, and just so you know, it has video. Late at night, an officer was watching surveillance cameras at the station, and this is what he saw. A figure walks through the sally port of the station parking lot. He checked and the sally port door never opened, and he couldn't find anyone in the parking lot. Scariest things police have seen, Part 7. At around 2 a.m., a young officer returned back to the patrol station because she was coming off shift. At that time of night, the station was usually empty. As she was walking towards the locker room, she walked by an empty admin area. She saw an older male officer that she didn't recognize, so she greeted him. He ignored her, and as she looked over her shoulder, she noticed he was gone. She was creeped out, but she just told herself she was imagining things. A couple of days went by, and she saw the picture of the same officer she saw that night on the wall of fallen officers. The officer had killed himself several years before. Scariest things police have seen, Part 6. One evening, several officers brought in a combative subject who was arrested for domestic violence. As they were bringing him into holding, they walked past cell number 1. The officers didn't pay much attention to him, but there was a guy standing in the cell. He looked normal, there was nothing really out of the ordinary about him. Later on in the shift, the officer was asked by a sergeant to do a head count before transporting the prisoners to county jail. The officer started with cell 1 and found it was empty. Everyone started to panic because they thought they lost a prisoner. They went over all the paperwork and found no one was ever placed in cell 1. The officers went to check video surveillance and found that sure enough, indeed, there was someone standing in cell 1. But the creepy thing was, as soon as the officers walked by the cell door, he just blinks out of existence. The officers tried to put this evidence of paranormal activity on a DVD or USB drive, but the footage didn't show up. Scariest things police have seen, Part 5. Now this one's from a 911 dispatcher. She got a call from a family saying their teenage daughter was possessed. The dispatcher assumed it might be a mental health issue or possibly drug related, but the family assured her she had no history of anything like that. The family members were holding her down, and over the phone, the dispatcher could hear 2 people yelling at each other. The dispatcher asked the family to tell whoever was yelling at her to stop. The family replied, "It's her." The dispatcher said, "I know it's her. Get whoever's yelling at her to stop." The family replied, "It's her." Both voices. The dispatcher couldn't really explain it, but she could definitely tell she was listening to a young girl's voice with an adult male yelling back. In this situation, do not call 911, call a Catholic priest. Scariest things police have seen, Part 4. About 20 years ago, several officers responded to an alarm call at an old PTA building in Austin, Texas. They found an unsecured door on one side of the property. The youngest officer posted himself there while the other officer went to search the property. The officer was staring right at the door when all of a sudden the alarm sounded again and the door slammed shut right in his face. The senior officer ran right back over to his position and asked why he slammed the door. The youngest officer said, "I didn't." The officers requested assistance from a canine unit. The dog searched the building and found nothing. Even though the dog was acting hinky like someone was in the building, it never picked up a scent. Finally, a key holder showed up. The officers told him what happened and he said, "Well, you know the place is haunted, right?" He told them there was a secretary that used to work there for 30 years, and after she died, there were reports she kept showing up for work. Like and follow for more creepy cop stories. Scariest things police have seen, Part 3. A deputy who worked at Backwoods County area stopped his vehicle because he had to go to the bathroom. The nearest bathroom was 30 minutes away, so he decided to stop on the side of the road. The deputy had this unnerving feeling like someone was watching him. He looked around, and about 20 feet from his patrol vehicle, he saw a shadowy figure standing there watching him. The deputy stopped, zipped up, and started questioning the figure, who did not respond at all. The deputy was scared that it might be an ambush, so he ordered the figure to show him his hands. Finally, the deputy pulled out a flashlight and aimed it right at the figure, who disappeared. The deputy could hear no movement, no rustling in the bushes, nothing. The deputy jumped back in his patrol vehicle, took one look back, and saw the creature there again, this time approaching him. So he took off. Like and share for more creepy police stories. Scariest things police have seen, Part 2. A police department started receiving calls from a vacant house twice a night for almost a week. The voice on the phone sounded like an elderly lady with Alzheimer's, barely audible, saying, please help, with coughing. The voice on the phone was totally unresponsive to dispatch's questions. Every time police went to the house, there was no one there. A records check showed that the previous owner of the house was a woman taking care of her elderly mother who was dying of lung cancer. Please like and share for more creepy police stories. Today I'm starting a new video series called Scariest Things Police Have Seen, Part 1. Officers were dispatched to a call about a burglary in progress. The homeowner was in the kitchen and heard running upstairs. Officers arrived and set up a perimeter around the house. A canine officer gave several warnings saying that they were going to let a canine loose. Just as he gave the command, a perimeter officer saw a hand pull the curtain back on the top floor and relayed the information over the radio. The canine officer sent the dog in, and sure enough, no one was found. The perimeter officer was 100% certain of what he saw, and the homeowner was sure he heard running upstairs. Like for part 2.